The Panasonic G90 or G91 shares the same sensor as the GH5. Could this be a viable alternative to the GH5? Let's take a closer look. Hi, welcome to this review of the G90 or G91, depending on where you live. I think it's also called G95 somewhere. This is the mid-budget alternative to the GH5. It shares the same sensor, but it has some, in my opinion, very important differences in comparison to the GH5, which I will cover right now. This video will be very video-centric, so if you're a photographer, I would recommend to check out another review. As I already mentioned, the G90 shares the same sensor as the GH5, but the processing power is very different, and I think that's the main reason why there is such a big difference when it comes to certain video features. What are the main differences from this camera to the GH5? Well, first of all, it's smaller. It doesn't have the same video features, there's no 10-bit video at all, and it uses other batteries. The batteries on the G91 are the same batteries that you found already on the GH2 or on the G81, so if you have one of these two cameras, you can use the batteries with this camera. Also, you have the option to get a vertical grip to the camera to extend battery life. The battery grip is very important because if you use the second battery, you have the ability to shoot over 2 hours of 4K video uninterrupted. As I already mentioned, this camera doesn't have the 10-bit video modes that you see on the GH5. It also doesn't output 10-bit. So you're stuck with 4K up to 30p in 8-bit and also in 1080p up to 60 frames per second. I think 8-bit is still a viable option for many shooting scenarios. For example, when you need a fast turnaround or when you're just shooting for YouTube, I think 8-bit is more than enough for most scenarios. Like in this example, I shoot on the GH5 in 8-bit and I use the Leica 709 color profile, which is more than enough for YouTube. But I think the implementation in this camera is not that good as it is in the GH5. For example, you are stuck with a bitrate up to 28 Mbits per second, and that's not very much. And if you want to push the color a little bit, the picture falls apart really fast. What I found weird is that this camera has Vlog-L installed. On the GH5 you have to pay over $100 or euros to get the Vlog upgrade, but it's already implemented on this camera. It sounds great, but I did some tests and it's just disastrous. I mean, the Vlog-L on this camera is really not that good implemented, and 8-bit is not enough to color correct any log profile. So if you want to use Vlog on this camera, I can't recommend it at all. You will get very bad results because of the banding and the color. It just breaks apart, the codec doesn't hold up. You have 4K up to 100 Mbits, but it's not that much and it's only 8-bit 420, so the color information isn't just there to use this camera in Vlog. I think I could recommend this camera when used in the Cine D profile, but I'm not a big fan of Cine D because it has very weird skin tones and I don't like to grade it. I much more prefer the Leica 709 that you have on cameras like the GH5, and I think it's also on the G9 and on the newer full frame cameras, the S1, S1H and so on. So I think it's a pity that this camera doesn't feature the Leica 709 because it's, in my opinion, the best picture profile for these cameras, because the dynamic range is great enough for the Leica 709 color profile, and Vlog-L is not the greatest picture profile for MFT sensors. So it would be great if this camera would have the Leica 7 or 9, but it doesn't feature it. And if you can work around the Cinelike D profile, I think this can be a great 8-bit camera. But it would be much better if it would feature 10-bit. Enough talk about the 10-bit. Is this camera usable when it comes to other stuff? So I think the battery life with just one battery is not that great. I think it's around 1 hour. I would recommend getting the battery grip to this camera. It extends the shooting range up to 2 hours in 4K, which I think is really good and more than enough. So if you have enough spare batteries, I think 4 batteries should be sufficient for a whole shooting day. If you want to shoot weddings with it, I would get even more batteries because you burn through them really fast when you shoot continuous, like you would do on a wedding ceremony. When you shoot on and off and short clips, it should be enough if you have 4 batteries. The autofocus on this camera is not that bad. You have the possibility to adjust this function, and also I think the processing power is enough for HD. In 4K it's not that great, so I would only trust this camera in full HD. I think it is comparable to the GH5 when it comes to autofocus, which in my opinion is rather good. When I use the GH5 as a B camera, I use the autofocus all the time, and the autofocus is not as bad as many people claim. This camera has slow motion. You saw this feature in the B-roll of some of my other videos, but you don't have the ability to manually exposure the slow motion. So I would say you have slow motion, but it's very restricted. So you only have manual exposure up to 1080 60p, which is very good if you don't color grade. And the 120p you get with this camera in slow motion, it's usable but not for any professional use. Also the image degrades in slow motion, so there is also that. When it comes to ports, this camera is not that bad equipped. You have a microphone input, you have a headphone jack, but you only get a micro HDMI, so if you want to use an external monitor, it's not that great. I like the form factor and the handling on this camera. I really love the button layout of Panasonic cameras, it's really great. You also have a back dial on this camera, but the buttons are not as responsive as on the flagship models like the GH5 and the G9 probably too. So if you want to get this camera as a B camera to the GH5, you will immediately notice the difference, but when you are only used to this camera, it might be good enough for you. As I already mentioned, this camera features the same sensor as the GH5. So you have the same great 5-axis image stabilization and the great image quality that you get with the GH5. Unfortunately, the codecs limit this quality quite a bit. This camera also has a crop in 4K, like the GH5 had back then. So if you want to use Super 35 lenses with this camera, you should use a Speedbooster XL to get the right equivalent. So what's my conclusion? Well, it's not really a baby GH5. You get the same sensor, you get the great 5-axis image stabilization, you get 4K, you get a microphone jack, but you don't get the same video features that you get on the GH5, which are 10-bit video, which are 4K up to 60p, which are variable frame rates up to 180 frames per second. So it's rather limited, but it still feels great in the hand. So overall, it's a good package. If you can live with the rather limited codecs, I think it's a budget option instead of the GH5. But I think the G9 came down in price quite a bit, and the G9 is very close to the GH5, so you might want to get a G9 instead, especially if you want to photograph with it. And the GH5 is also very cheap nowadays. I mean, I got a second body for 900 euros, so the GH5 is in reach for most users, and if you can spare the extra bucks, I would really recommend getting the GH5 instead of the G91. So that was my short review of the G91. I hope you liked this review. I post new videos every Friday, so if you want to see more, consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a comment down below. I hope you have a nice day and create something extraordinary.